So people are divided over the latest Marvel movie that came out this weekend, The Marvels, with some saying that it was the worst Marvel movie of all time. So I saw the movie, and was it really as bad as people are saying? And what, if anything, can Christians take away from this movie? Well, let's talk about it. So if you don't know anything about this movie, The Marvels is the sequel to Captain Marvel of 2019 and features the big screen debut from Miss Marvel from her truly smashing hit series, and also the grown-up Monica Rambeau from WandaVision. So in this movie, after an encounter with a suspicious wormhole in space, Captain Marvel, Miss Marvel, and Monica Rambeau find that their powers have been entangled without knowing why. So despite the differences, they realize that they have to band together to stop a dangerous Kree revolutionary who poses a threat to the universe as we know it. Now I realize that that wasn't much of a really big synopsis to really kind of tell you exactly what the movie's about, but there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that here soon. But first, let's go ahead and start with what I liked about the movie. So first off, there were some legitimately funny portions of this film. Now, whether I was laughing because these scenes were sharp and witty, or whether it was because of their sheer ridiculousness, I'll leave you to decide that if you watch. But nonetheless, I can honestly say that I had some genuine laughs as I watched this movie. Another thing that I liked were the wardrobes and the character designs, because the outfits that were worn by the characters really stood out, and I also thought that they were really imaginative, and the outfits actually really popped in a lot of the action scenes, which I have to admit, I was really skeptical about the action scenes going in, but they really did have some good combat sequences, especially when the power switching started. And that actually reminds me, I won't lie, before the movie started, I was expecting some cringy, preachy girl power dialogue, but I'm happy to report that there wasn't very much of that in this movie. Now, before we get to my review of the movie from a Christian perspective, unfortunately, we have to talk about my main gripe with this movie, which was the story. By far, in almost every possible way, the major problem with this movie was the overall story, or better yet, the lack of one to begin with. So the movie starts off kind of fast and keeps stringing together loosely related sequences without really letting the plot simmer or develop. And the same thing happened with the character relationships, because I honestly don't think that it's possible to overstate just how little time was spent developing emotional conflicts, or honestly, any real stakes throughout the entire film. What really makes a good movie is when you can get emotionally invested knowing that the characters have something big to lose. But when it comes to this movie, those moments literally never came for me. Instead, it left me feeling like I was watching superficial interactions whose sole purpose was just to provide filler until the next combat scene. For a little perspective, with the runtime of 1 hour and 45 minutes, The Marvels is officially MCU's shortest movie of all time, but it doesn't feel like it with all of the content that they try to pack in. And the same is true with their wild tonal shifts. It really felt like the movie didn't know where it was going, both in tone and emotion. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, but let's just say there were some scenes of intense destruction, like what we saw in the trailer, and instead of allowing for the appropriate emotions to be felt, they just moved on without acknowledging them at all and went on to an action or comedic scene. Because this was happening so much, it really made the movie feel like it was emotionally awkward and shallow, and it was like people were dying in one scene, laughing in the next, then in a fight, then in some place where they should have been crying but weren't, and so on. It really had me like, what is going on? Because I couldn't tell what this movie was or what the point was. So it's because this movie lacked cohesion, I guess. There wasn't very many memorable parts or characters, and I think that the villain may have been the most generic MCU villain that I've ever seen. So now I understand why some people said that watching this movie was like watching a car crash, which is painful, but not nearly as painful as actually being in a car crash. And if you ever are, keep in mind the sponsor of today's video, Morgan & Morgan. If you're ever in a car accident, first make sure that you're okay. Secondly, make sure you file a police report. Thirdly, make sure you contact your insurance company. And lastly, get legal representation. And trust me, I get it. If you're anything like me, the thought of hiring a lawyer sounds like a daunting task with too much paperwork, too many hours spent in meetings and doing research and so on. But Morgan & Morgan made a simple way for you to submit a claim, upload documents, and communicate with your legal team all from your smartphone. So if you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without even having to leave your couch. For more information, go to forthepeople.com or dial #law, that's #529 from your cell phone. All right, now back to the video. All right, so with all of the bad things that I have to say about the film, it's not as though there wasn't anything redeeming about the film that Christians can't take away from it. So when I spoke about the villain generally being generic, one thing that stood out to me was how most villains see themselves as victims first. In the movie, we see how the villain, Darben, she's actually a sympathetic victim because her and her people were wronged and are suffering the consequences of things that they didn't do. But while on the surface, Darben's crusade to save Kree might seem understandable, as we hear in the trailer, her plan to save her people rests obsessed on targeting planets that Captain Marvel calls home.
She's targeting every planet we call home.
So this ultimately boils down to wanting to get revenge, resulting in hurting several innocents, which leads her to becoming a villain in the process. But what I found so interesting was that she could argue that she was justified in what she was doing because she had been wronged in the first place. Ultimately, there was a stark contrast between how she internally perceived herself as doing the right thing, but externally, she was on a selfish, villainous rampage. And this made me think about our natural tendency as humans to deceive ourselves. There's a lot of times in our lives when we think that our intentions are good, while also being completely unaware that our true underlying motivations are completely different. For example, we might think that we're wanting to help someone like Darwin did, but really we're helping them only for a selfish reason. I think this is one of the reasons why the Bible says that the heart is deceitful above all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? And just like we witnessed in the movie, if we're not aware of this, then we might just retaliate and become no better than the ones who hurt us in the first place. In other words, we become the villain. This is why Peter talked about this in 1 Peter when he talks about how Jesus modeled what our response to being wrong should look like. He says, "To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." And in verse 3:9, he says, "Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing." So Peter recognized that we won't always be treated fairly, but like Jesus, we shouldn't use that as an excuse to mistreat others or forget what God called us to be. We're called to live at peace with all people if possible, and ultimately, our responsibility is to love our enemies, because God showed this love towards us while we were enemies towards him. So when we use evil done towards us to justify evil towards others, we undermine our very reason to be upset, because ultimately, like Peter said, Jesus didn't respond with evil towards us, even though he was more innocent than anyone. Unlike Darwin, he responded with grace and offered us forgiveness even when we didn't deserve it. So while this movie is definitely not the return to form that everyone was hoping to have from Marvel, I think that you can still enjoy the movie if you temper your expectations to a movie that doesn't take itself too seriously and has some pretty good action scenes. Even though I didn't think that this movie had much of a plot and just came off as a jumbled and unrelated sequence of events, if you do choose to go see this movie, I pray that you'll think about the potential pitfalls of becoming a villain ourselves. So are you planning to go see the movie? Let me know down below, and the next time that you forget that God forgave you for all of the things that you've done wrong and you refuse to forgive others, what are you gonna say? What do you mean?